passage from Luke chapter 7, verses 36 to 50. Now, I'm going to read through it very quickly, and then we can look at some points that I feel is relevant to us. So it talks about essentially an encounter between Jesus, a woman, and a man in a very social setting, right? So here is the passage. When one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. A woman in the town who lived in a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house, so she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. As she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. When the Pharisees who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who's touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner. Jesus answered him, Simon, I have something to tell you. Tell me, teacher, he said. Two people owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii and the other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so forgive the debts of both. Now, which of them will love him more? Simon replied, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven. You have judged correctly, Jesus said. Then he turned towards the woman and said to Simon, do you see this woman? I came into your house. You did not give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with the tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman, from the time I entered, has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet. Therefore, I tell you, many sins have been forgiven, as a great love has shown. But whoever has been forgiven little loves little. Then Jesus said to her, your sins are forgiven. The other guests began to say among themselves, who is he who even forgives sins? Jesus said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. Now, there are four such accounts in the gospel about someone pouring a very expensive bottle of perfume on Jesus. Now, in Matthew, Mark, and John, it all refers to someone. It refers to the same incident that involves Mary, Lazarus' sister. Whereas this one seems to be a completely different encounter. Funnily, both the places happen in the name of a guy named Simon, but both Simons are different. While one, the three incidences refers to Simon the leper, this one is Simon a Pharisee. So who is a Pharisee? Pharisee, for us to understand, Pharisees are people who are in a position of religious authority in the community. They are concerned about outward recognition and honor. They are very enthusiastic about making converts, and they emphasize on observing the legalistic minutiae of the law. What they mean by that is, like, they want to observe even the little bit of things, like there are secondary laws in the Bible that they develop from the primary laws. Like, for example, I understand if a chicken were to lay an egg on the Sabbath, they were not supposed to eat it because the chicken egg came on a Sabbath. Those kind of laws used to be there. So these are people who follow such laws fully. Now, it is in that kind of a person's house this incident is happening. One of the things that I found a little bit puzzling was that this Pharisee, Pharisee, the word itself comes from a root word that means separated, means that they want to stay away from people who they consider as sinners and people who they consider as do not belong to their kind of group or class or belief or whatever. So they want to separate themselves and live. So how did this woman come there? Now, I was thinking of perhaps the local custom, the local kind of a situation during our own wedding, right? When Shikan and I got married, like we had this, reception, and there were people invited and things like that. But in such times, there are always a bunch of people, from perhaps the lower echelons of society. They would come and stand outside, wanting to join. Now, obviously, they cannot be, entertained with the regular guests. But what the custom was to, guys, can you just wait for a little while? We'll invite you in, or we'll provide you food, and then you can, go. But you can't come and, be part of the regular guests. But then, obviously, we cannot shun them or say that go away. So perhaps this lady was one such person who was not invited, but still was there, trying to be, in the situation. And also, second thing, what we see was where she was standing was at his feet. I was trying to work this out in my head, and it looks like, and the word, I think there's a clue in the, in one of the verses, which says that Jesus was reclining. Reclining is like probably, sitting with the feet kind of crossed, both legs, and then sitting at the table, waiting to be served. At that time, she was at his feet. And then she notices something, that Simon hadn't given Jesus, water to wash his feet. I mean, which was the custom there. Now, I think it is, I feel, a sign of disrespect, if not. So I'm even wondering why he invited him there. Perhaps if you see, I mean, there are some clues in other passages of the Bible where whenever Jesus was encountered, when Pharisees encountered Jesus, they tried to challenge him, tried to trap him in that kind of situation. However, in this situation, he has been invited, and then he has not been offered this water to wash his feet. And at that time, she seems to really understand who Jesus was. She seems to understand who Jesus was, and look, just by looking at Jesus, and tears started flowing from her eyes, and she literally was washing Jesus' feet with tears from her eyes. And not only that, she even proceeded to wipe his feet with her hair. They would, the normal thing would be for people when they are invited, as I understand from the Jewish custom, was not only to offer water and also provide them cloth to wipe and dry their feet. But here she is using her hair, which is considered, if we read 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 15 says, for women, it is her glory. So, so she was really putting something that is considered as a glory, for her to actually wipe his feet. So that is not only humility, that is a kind of, an adoration, because she understood who Jesus was. Now, here, looking at it, I'm just going to read this passage, going back to that verse. On looking at this, and before that, she even poured that oil on his feet. Now, when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner. I mean, the guy was logical, all right? So he said, yeah, if this Jesus was a prophet, but if he was a prophet, he'd know who she was, and then he would act in such a way. But what is basically wrong with him? While his logic was reasonably all right, but his premise was wrong. Jesus was actually going one step further. He wasn't there. It is not that he didn't know who she was, but he was still allowing her knowing who she was. So this, I think, is one of the key learnings for us. Now, this also kind of reminded me of something from my college days. I think perhaps a little bit remotely connected, but nevertheless. So when we used to have these college debates, right? So the idea was always to win. Somehow you want to score one over the other and then win. But our teacher at that time, he told me something that kind of stayed with me long after I left university, which was that he said that maturity is the pursuit of truth. I was like, oh, yeah. So the idea is not to win a debate, but to actually understand what is going on, to actually not score, a point over your opponent, but to actually understand what is the key thing here. So here, the Pharisee was concerned about, he was laying his kind of thought process on this situation and trying to make, he is not a prophet. But what a big mistake he has made, right? So let us see how in Jesus versus Pharisee, the Pharisee versus this woman, I'm going to just juxtapose, what all happened. No, Simon was self-righteous. He thought he was following all the law, that he figured out who Jesus was, that he was not a prophet because he was entertaining sinners. But whereas she acknowledged that she was a sinner. There is not much said about her in the sense we don't know what her name was. Maybe Luke was polite, given that she being a sinner, he didn't want to name her and shame her, perhaps. And also, we don't know how she came to know Jesus, but she knew, in spite of her being a sinner, who Jesus was. So, here is the thing. Simon, this guy who had this arranged this banquet, he knew he was self-righteous, whereas she was a sinner. When Simon did not honor Jesus, she showed adoration. On the other hand, so this is she knew who Jesus was, so she showed that adoration. Imagine this. Then Simon had the privilege of having Jesus over to his place. At some point, he would have met him, given the invitation. He came over, but he missed the point, whereas he was not even invited. But she came, and she perhaps had to endure a difficult, place, right? And all these self-righteous people standing around, and Jesus, who's obviously not like part of them. But she is coming and she has to probably endure. Everybody knew who she was, right? That she was a sinner. Probably she was from that area. So they all know who she was. She didn't mind about all that. When he didn't even know who she was, who Jesus was, but she actually she endured the difficult place. But as a result, what happened was in that encounter, Jesus forgave her. She knew who she was. And Jesus spoke forgiveness, but whereas Simon, who invited him, though he had Jesus there, he didn't get that privilege. So the key point, I think, for us to think is, who do we think Jesus is? All right, are we thinking someone that we can work out in our minds, or we really understand his message to acknowledge that we are sinners who need him in our lives, right? As I said, Simon's logic was right, but his premise was wrong. So are we willing to take Jesus at his word and understand more and more? The more we know Jesus, the more we'll be able to understand. When we come to the point of surrender and say, Lord, explain, let me understand you, and we explain, when we know who Christ is, we come to a point of really accepting him, and then this adoration will be a reaction in our heart. Now, here, when I was, researching for this and looking up stuff, I came across some points which I thought was really amazing for us to even evaluate our worship. So, as we can see, this is one of the highest form of worship, what she does. And there are, in Daniel, I think the book of Daniel, there is also a passage which talks about, even the saints, men falling at Jesus' feet, because Jesus is holy, he is Lord, and also it is actually, they realize that we are not worthy in front of him. So it is the reaction. So how much we know Jesus, that much we'll be able to, worship him. So now looking at the worship element of what she did, I think there are a few points for us to reflect. One is worship is for sinners, meaning like we will worship Christ, without sin in heaven. But as long as we are in this world, we will perhaps, worship Christ even though we are sinners. So we don't have to come to a point of, having, at this moment, I don't feel sinful, so I can worship Jesus. But we can actually, approach him and worship him the way we are. Now, my dad had a friend. So he never used to participate in communion because he said, I'm not worthy. It looked like a kind of humility, but also even as a small boy, you used to think, he's missing the point here. Something is wrong with his logic. So that I kind of, when I was reading this, that's what I was thinking. We are never going to be sin-free to worship Jesus or say participate in communion or going to church and whatever else. The point is that he accepts us as we are. So, however, we are people, we should be able to acknowledge where we are vis-a-vis Jesus, that we are people of sin. We are sinners. Second is, worship takes at the place of Jesus, at the feet of Jesus. As I said, in the book of Revelation and in the book of Daniel, men find themselves falling at the feet of Jesus when they recognize him as God. Now, that is the second thing. Why it happens is that awareness when it comes to people, when we understand that Jesus is indeed God, he is not some, a good teacher or anyone going around the world saying interesting stuff. We know that is God himself. So that will prompt us to actually go to the feet of Jesus. Next is worship is also a preoccupation with the person of Jesus Christ, which is he was worshipping him and him alone. She was not bothered about who was around them, who was, who was kind of looking at her, what judgment they were passing. It is like she was at a place where she was really worshiping him. She was completely preoccupied with Jesus. And also, next thing is worshiping is not about receiving something from God, but giving something back to him. Don't get me wrong. We need God for the provisions of our lives. However, in terms of worship is something that we are able to give to God, irrespective of our needs or wants and limitations or whatever else. That is something that we are able to give to God. Next is worship involves, the emotions. Sometimes worship involves emotions. Us being in the Western world, we're not very, open about our emotions, let's say. So we are always, we are understated. We are, even I have become a little bit tight upper lip, 15 years living here. So, sorry?
You think corrupted.
Well, I don't know if I'll use that word, but yeah. So eventually, so it is like that. Now again, going back to another world, another place. There was this guy. My dad used to say, when he came to the church, he would always be at the entrance, kneeling down, beginning to end. And he was the wealthiest man in the church as well. Just as a point. So he used to just stand there, kneeling down completely throughout the service. And then when he got up, he just, that was his way of worship. What I mean to say is, sometimes like we don't have to be tight upper lip about everything. We can really, we can allow our emotions, right? Which is also part of God gave us the emotions. When we feel like it, we can be free with him. And next thing is, Luke, at least, we don't know what she spoke to Jesus, but Luke just records her actions there. So we don't know whether she actually said anything. Maybe Luke thought that was moot point. Whatever he talks about, what the Pharisee thought, what Jesus said, but he just records her actions. So she says more here, to worship without uttering one word. So we could also do that. There is this song. You say it best when you say nothing at all. That's one of the songs that I like so much. So it is like that. So she is showing that adoration. Finally, worship is not easily hindered. When we have that worship in our hearts, it will come out. We are not going to be bothered about anything. We are not going to be obstructed by anything. We will be able to pour our hearts out to Lord. So, if our worship, if we all know Christ, I believe we all know why he came into this world. We all know that he died on the cross to give us this salvation. Perhaps this woman knew already from his teachings that this is what Jesus was praying for her to get that emotion. As they say, salvation is free, but it was not. It cost something to him. Salvation is free for us, but Jesus paid the ultimate price so that we can enjoy this for free. So, are we acknowledging that Jesus is, offer of salvation in our lives? Are we acknowledging that Jesus is Lord? Are we acknowledging that Jesus actually paid a big price for us to get this? If we understand that, if we know that, if we meditate on that, if we know Christ more, our worship also will be, one of all these dimensions we saw, and we'll be able to worship Christ more. So I really want us to think about two things. One is, are we trying to work out Jesus in our head and missing the point? Or are we able to understand what he is saying with humility and acknowledging that we are sinners, that we are able to worship him as Lord and receive this forgiveness and salvation? And if we are at that place, now how are we worshiping? Are we able to really understand Jesus for who he is, that we are able to really pour out our hearts? If not, for us, it is probably a time for us to acknowledge once more where we are at that point. Thank you.